Alrighty, let me start my PowerShell countdown timer so I keep you vaguely on track. Thank you, welcome. I don't like virtual events because I can't see the whites of your eyes and my jokes sometimes go unnoticed, but I'll soldier on. So, as Ben said, talk to you today and demonstrate, of course, very much into live demos, how we can use VMware with automating, managing, VMware. So let's crack through the slides. Well, who is Guy Leech? Okay. Background, developer, wrote my first program in 1980. Used to write device drivers for Unix, C, C++, moved into C#, got into end user computing in 95, Citrix, Horizon, VMware. I do a lot of PowerShell. I do a lot of PowerShell scripting for software vendors, bit of troubleshooting. So hopefully that gives you a bit of my background. But my key point takeaway there is that I am from developer background. But you don't need that developer background to be able to do this stuff. That's the key, really. It makes it easy for me, but you don't have to be a developer. Okay, so why we automate? We talked a bit about this in the preamble anyway. We'll go through these quickly. Consistency, because humans make mistakes. Computers generally don't, unless the human makes a mistake in programming it, particularly in terms of following run books or making changes to things. It can be a heck of a lot faster than clicking through stuff. I use it a lot for just general troubleshooting and making changes and checking things, much quicker than using a GUI. And you can do stuff whenever you want. You don't have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do these things. Schedule tasks, bang, job done. And I'm lazy. I'm inherently lazy, as I tell people. So same thing again, don't reinvent the wheel. If you think somebody's probably done this before, and this is very true in VMware. Again, I'll make the slide deck available afterwards. It's got a lot of references to people, and of course, GitHub is just a great place to look for stuff, as well as your favorite search engine, as long as that's not Bing. So somebody's probably done what you've done, what you want to do, so you don't have to write it from scratch. But before you run it in your production environment with 1,000 VMs, just make sure that it's going to work for you, that it's not accidentally or maliciously bad and it's going to wipe everything from the face of the earth, and you're going to go to your Commvault backups. Oh, do I get a price for that? And you've probably got better things to do than this boring admin stuff as well, haven't you? Of course, it can improve your skills. I've worked with people in the past who, technical people, who would boast that they couldn't script, and they boasted about it. It's like, what? Particularly in this day and age, really, it's nothing close.
All right. So with that, Guy, the floor is yours.
Comment blocks, and again, making the code easy to read, easy to use, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this session, although I do have another session about that sort of side of things. And hopefully there's less comeback. As long as you get that script right, you test it, you make it as bulletproof as possible. So when you're writing your script, you start thinking, what would happen if that failed? Could this fail? Could that fail? And write the code around it to make that as strong as you possibly can. Reason to use PowerShell over other things. There are other scripting languages you could use, or other languages you could use, C#, Python, etc. But with PowerShell, it's good because we use it as a scripting language. We can go and find scripts on GitHub or other places, but we can also use it interactively. So that's what I do a lot. I don't live in these legacy CMD prompts. Go and sit in PowerShell all day, learn how to do things, because there might be a little bit of a learning curve, but once you know how to work with objects from one particular set of PowerShell commandlets, as we call them, then it's very easy to use that knowledge of objects and filtering and sorting and grouping with any other set of commandlets. So learn VMware, and you can go very quickly to Citrix or Azure and those sort of side of things. And one of the beauties of it is you've got a persistent command line history. So if I switch to if I use Windows Terminal, because I'm all modern like that, killing off Skype. I don't know why I was even running Skype. But if I want to find somewhere where, let's say, I've connected to a VMware server before, well, I know it's connect, so I can actually hit in here Control R. Notice it says back search, and then I can just go connect, and there's my connect that I've used before. If I want to look for another one, if that's not quite the one I want, then I can just Control R. If I'm too quick, I can Control S to go forward. And that's persistent. As long as you've got a persistent local profile, then you've got all the commands that you've ever typed. I can't seem to type at the moment. You see that's my history save path is there in my local profile, and I can actually then go and see how many commands I've got in there. Let's get content on that. In caps lock on for no valid reason other than I've got fat fingers, and we'll see how many. I've got 20,000 lines of history in there, but I don't have to up arrow. I can up arrow through it, but Control R I can search. But if you're on site and you're doing things you don't want your customer to find out, and you're doing it in PowerShell, that's the flip side of having a persistent profile. And there's lots of stuff available out there. Go through the VMware user groups, through GitHub. If people follow you, follow people on Twitter. And for those of us who've got terrible memories, as I'm not the youngest of people, my memory is definitely going, then you don't have to remember a huge amount because there's built-in help, there's tab completion, there's control completion. Let's say, for instance, if I want to have a look at, let's switch to PowerShell 7, shall we? This is PowerShell 7, where we can use PowerCLI as well. This is the latest version released last week. So we can do things like, so I know it's get-VM to get my VMs, for instance, but what are the arguments? Well, you can probably tab through. What you can also do is control space, and that will show them all. I can use the cursor keys to move through them. And if you notice bottom left, it actually tells me the type as well, so that it makes it easy for me to get it right. So for instance, that's actually telling me, because of the square brackets here, that it's an array. So I can get a list of virtual machines all in one go. So machine 1, machine 2, machine 3, without having to do 3 separate commands. So tab completions are pretty much everything, and then a huge number of things built in, so you can actually get the help on those commands themselves to understand the options, and then you can interrogate them themselves as well. And there's plenty of stuff out there to help you, particularly from sort of VMware, Citrix, Microsoft, etc. And as I said a few minutes ago, once you've got the hang of it, you can transfer the knowledge of, let's say, VMware commandlets, because they're using proper objects, to any other set of commandlets. So sometimes there's a steep learning curve, but then once you understand it, it all clicks. Suddenly it's, you can go in all guns blazing. And we can also, sorry, I clicked over that rather quickly. There's aliases, so I can start typing things like, if I'm a Linux person, I started with some Unix as well, I can type things like ls for list files, ps, for those sorts of things. They're aliases. Great to make things quick. Not so great in scripts, because it makes it much more difficult to understand what you actually mean in the script. So don't use those in scripts, because it makes it harder to understand. And we can get stuff out and in from these various file formats. I use PowerShell a lot for reporting to CSV or even HTML and emailing it out. So make it easy for sort of reporting tools where you perhaps don't have those reporting tools or they're extra money. So I'm going fairly fast here, so hopefully you can follow, mainly because I've got a heck of a lot to get through in 45 minutes. So how do we get PowerShell CLI on there in the first place? Easiest way is with an online installation. That's it. You'll get a couple of prompts about trusted repository and so on. If you're doing this machine-wide, then you'll need to be running that elevated, but you can install it per user. And if typically what I'd suggest to my customers is, have a jump box, so a server OS with TS cows on there, so that people can put all the consoles, all the PowerShell SDKs, put all their scheduled tasks, put everything on those boxes. So if you wanted to install it for everyone, you'd need to be an admin. The default is to install it per machine, unless you use the minus scope parameter. see what modules we've got available, and use update module. And I put this in today when I updated this deck, because the new 12.4, if you have a look at my Twitter account, or if you look at the PowerShell CLI Twitter account, you'll see they changed their code signing certificate, not just the code signing certificate, but the provider, between 12.3 and 12.4 of the PowerShell CLI, which seems to have caused, or just does cause problems. There's a link there, and which you'll get in the deck, to a tweet where I show you how to remove everything. Otherwise, you'll get these errors. So you can get it on there. And generally, there's no need to have older versions of PowerShell CLI on there, because they'll be backwardly compatible. If you want to do an offline installation, again, that's a link to it, but it's pretty much a case of downloading the files via a saved module somewhere, because all a module is a directory full of files. So then you just copy it to a suitable location, which is in your path. So whilst you're familiar with $path for your executables, or %path if you use legacy CMD, then we have a similar environment variable called PS module path. But again, we can just split it on those semicolon delimiters, and then you can see all the places it will look for PowerShell. So if you do an import module, it will look in all those locations for that particular module. By module, it's actually just a directory name. So modules are actually quite simple things to manipulate. You can just literally copy folders around. But if you are doing it manually, make sure it's read-only, so make sure the code can't be Trojaned, and the files themselves aren't blocked, which is done using NTFS, alternate data streams. But you can either right-click in Explorer, unblock, or there's an unblock -file commandlet. Okay, so we've got our commandlets installed. We now need to connect to either an ESXi instance or vCenter. We can connect to one or the other. And PowerCLI even will work with ESXi without vCenter, but you won't get some of the functionality such as templating. But you can even go straight to ESXi when you've got vCenter if you want. But generally, you would connect to vCenter to give you all the functionality you require if you've got that in your environment. So I have that in my lab environment on some Dell rack mount servers running in my garage, picture behind me. So just import the modules you need. I put a tweet out yesterday, shows a difference if you import VMware.PowerShell, which imports everything, compared with that one module, which is mostly what you need. It takes about an extra 20 seconds to load everything, which may not be important to you, but it may be. Now, credentials. Easiest way is path through. So if you're logged onto a domain, then easy enough. It'll pass through credentials automatically. Now, I'm actually running this on my laptop, which isn't domain joined. So if I don't put in a credential argument, I just tell it where to connect to. And again, even if you don't put any parameters in, you say, well, what do I do? It'll prompt you for the default parameters. So I can do a vCenter 04. Spell my name correctly for once. Now I'm not logged onto a domain, so it's passing. It can't pass anything through, or what it doesn't work. So this is PowerShell 7, where in PowerShell 5 you would get a GUI prompt. Here we have to specify on the command line, because PowerShell 7 is cross-platform, so it'll work on Linux and Mac as well. And if I remember my password and be able to type, multitasking. Wow, hold on. I might have to be quiet for a moment to get that right first time. Wow, there we go. And that's actually connected. That was actually returning an object, which I could have saved in the variable if I wanted to. So let's go and get. Disconnect that. Could have used a -confirm : $false. Let's use that. Dollar connection equals. Hasn't given me an error. Have I got something in my connection? Yes, I have. So you can, and then you can see what else we can do with it. So I was saying earlier about exploring things. Not get method, you silly boy. Don't you love guide demos? Get member. I would normally type GM, but I didn't want to use an alias. So you can see we've got various properties of that connection, various methods. But once we've connected, we can then do things like get-VM, which by default will get all the virtual machines. But if we want to just get the ones which were powered on, what you can see here, we've got a power stated, powered on or powered off. I can say where power. Let's get this keyboard replaced. It's obviously very faulty. Equals powered on. Then we can just get my powered on VMs. So we've got pass-through credentials, explicit, where we could pass it on the command line, but that's a bad idea because it will put those clear text passwords in that persistent profile that I was talking about. You can use get credential and pass a credential object, which would be my preference. You can actually get it to save a credential, although I don't think this works in version 7. This new VI credential store item and the subsequent commandlets definitely don't work in version 7. I can't see any reason why they don't, because what that does is just store in your local profile encrypted credentials that only you on that machine can decrypt. It will automatically use those if pass-through doesn't work, but for some reason that doesn't work in version 7. But I've tweeted out a workaround a couple of days ago where we can export those to client XML, and they're still encrypted, so we can use them and actually, if we look at my PowerShell profile, we probably missed it there. Start a new PowerShell. See, part of my PowerShell profile actually goes and reads a VMware credential into a variable, so I can then use that immediately if I want to. So use connect VI server to one or all of the machines. -4 basically suppresses all the prompts that you might get about non-trusted certificates and that sort of side of things. But we can overrule those permanently, either per user or per machine, using that set PowerShell configuration. Then if we look at these variables, those tell us what we're connected to at any point in time. So if I say global VI servers in here, that doesn't exist. Just going to provide this. Terminal automatically puts stuff in the clipboard without me having to right click. That was good, wasn't it? That's a great demo. Perhaps that doesn't work in. That doesn't seem to work in 7. All right, we'll sake of time, I've got 26 minutes left. We'll not show that working, but yeah, that looks like something else that doesn't exist in 7. I'll add a note to that slide. Notice the connection doesn't stay alive forever. It stays alive the same amount of time that your login to vCenter would be. So, if you leave it, if you connect and come back, 6 hours later, you'll probably find your connection's timed out. So you'd need to do a connect to VI server again. Disconnect at the end of your script, end of your session is optional. Best practice is to disconnect. Again, if you've saved the result from the connect VI server call, you can pipe that directly into disconnect. This is something that catches me out quite often in scripts. It's smart enough to know if you're already connected to the same vCenter and won't duplicate stuff, but if you're connected to a vCenter and one of the ESXi hosts on it and you do a get VM, you're quite likely to get duplicate VMs, for instance, because it will retrieve them both from vCenter and the ESXi and treat them separately. So the first couple of times you see that, it's a bit bizarre. It's like, why have I got 2 of those machines? But it's generally because you've got 2 connections. Okay, so what can we actually do when we've connected? Well, we can show properties of VMs, and we can go as deep as we want. I'll show you a script in a moment that I use in my lab, which sort of indicates the sorts of things we can do. We get snapshot information, so we can start to automate either reporting of snapshots or even deleting of them, because that's obviously good old snapshot creep in terms of storage. I think when we start this script of mine, I think I saw the other day I've got something like 57 snapshots, and that's just my lab, although I've got 149 VMs in there now. of which I only run about 40 at any one time. We can power things on, off, pause them. So I've got some scripts I use with my UPS. I've got a UPS in my lab. Doesn't last long with the rack mount servers, but should the power trip in my house, I want to be able to orderly, not necessarily shut things down, because if you try and shut things down, Sod's law says that you're going to start hitting lots of Windows updates, which will delay the shutdown. So rather than shutting down, I get my APC software to pause the VMs, so save the memory to file, because that way we won't get hit by the Windows updated shutdown. We can clone VMs. So we can either just do a simple clone of a VM, or we can create a new VM from template if we want to. Do a lot of manipulation on data stores in terms of interrogating what's on there, copying things around between data stores, including maintaining thin provision disks where the VMFS supports it. Do a lot of changing of things. So I've got various scripts I use for instance, changing the NICs so that I can swap from a VMX NIC to an E1000, so I can update VMware tools in certain environments, namely Citrix provisioning services, and then once that's done, replace the NIC back again with the VMX Net 1. So anything you can do in console, you can do through PowerShell. Now, the difficulty can be sometimes trying to figure out how to do it in PowerShell. Because it's not one of those consoles that actually tells you what it was doing PowerShell-wise. One of the Citrix consoles, Studio, does that for you. So you do something in that, and it tells you what it's actually done in PowerShell, because it is actually using PowerShell behind the scenes. But again, web search quite often is the way to do it, or RTFM, as we say. Now, if you think it's something to do with data stores, then if we go to one of these things, apologies if you hear my granddaughter crying in the background. So it's going to be something to do with data stores. So what I can do is get command alias GCM, get command minus module. So I only want to look at VMware modules, of which is quite a few. And I can say I want to look at anything which has got anything to do with data stores. And there you can see we can get data store, set data store. So what can I do with set data store? Okay, so what we'll do is we'll say help set data store, and again I'm going to tab complete. Now, if I do it without anything, it'll actually show that help in this window when it eventually responds to me. But what I tend to do is do a minus show window, which will pop that up in a separate text window, so that I can then examine that. It'll tell you all about the help, the options, give you some syntax, give you some examples, and if you really want, you can actually then look at the latest and greatest. You can specify online, and that will pop it up in a browser. So here's my Edge, and there we go. Set data store has just come up, which is quite useful because there's generally more on the web pages. So that's how we find, we interrogate, again. So what is there to do with networks in there? So let's have a look at network, because hopefully somebody is going to name their commandlets. A commandlet is just a compile function, effectively. That's what comes in a DLL. They're going to name them sensibly. So if something is to do with networks, it would have networks in the name, because in PowerShell we have this approved verb dash noun. So invoke, new, get, set. And as per Newton's third law, for every get, there's an equal opposite set. For every new, there's an equal opposite remove, for instance, generally speaking. So reporting, where you don't necessarily have the reporting add-ons or the things you want to report specifically. Again, for poor man's alert, so if you've not invested in a monitoring and alerting software solution, you can put your own in for, let's say, monitoring data stores. And when my data store gets to 95% full, then you send me an email, or send me an email with the 10 largest files on therein, or the oldest snapshots, that sort of things. And we can do things with inside the guests themselves with this invoke VM script. And the advantage of this is the VM doesn't have to have a network connection for that to work, because it will be able to communicate with vCenter in the same way you can have a VMware console, even if it's not a network, but you can't MSTSC to it. But some things you might find that PowerShell remoting, PS remoting is better, more scalable. Invoke VM, this script, if nothing else, is a little bit slow in the way it operates, in my experience. And pretty much anything else you want to do. So if I fire up, I thought I got it running, but I haven't. So let's just fire it up. So I'm going to fire up my script available on GitHub, which I use in my lab so that I don't have to go near vCenter. So it's designed for people who aren't necessarily vCenter admins, people familiar with that interface, so that they can develop and in VMs, and they can reset snapshots, take snapshots, reconfigure, etc., all in one simple user interface. So I've got the verbose mode on just so I can see what's going on, and this is the GUI it pops up. So what we can see is it's got a rich amount of information about the virtual machines themselves. So again, this is all via get-vm. By default, it only shows the powered on VMs. Again, with command line parameters, you can change that. And again, you can do a get help on a script if it's got a script block in, like all my scripts on GitHub do. So in the same way I showed you for some of the VMware commandlets, I can do a get help on this, or you can do a get help on the script. So you can see the information it's got in here in terms of CPU, memory, number of snapshots. I can sort these columns. So let's see, what's my biggest offender in terms of snapshots? This one. I can right click. That will actually bring up a menu where I've got actions. Again, this is all using something called WPF, Windows Presentation Framework, which is very easy to use within PowerShell if you want to GUI. It doesn't always need to be command line. Although I started my program career in the 80s on green screens connected over serial ports to Unix boxes. Oh, those were the days. So I can manage the snapshots. Again, all much simpler. So I can see, I can look at the details, restore, etc. from here if I want to. So this is a good example of a script if you want to know how to do things within VMware, because of the number of operations I've got in here in terms of being able to connect and disconnect NICs, mount ISOs, update the tools, power cycle, can move VMs to different data stores. And again, I can multiply select machines here as well. So I can operate on more than one machine at once. I can set up a default operation. So I've just double clicked on PVS 304. By default, that MSTSCs to it, so that's brought up this. So again, I don't need to use RDP Manager or anything like that. I just need to remember my password. Of course, I could click Remember Me, and that's using native MSTSC, so that would store it securely. And then I can just MSTSC to it from there if I want to, or I can do other things like getting the console. Although I've resized this monitor down, my main monitor is QH or whatever it's called, 2K, so I could do a larger one, or one that spans monitors. So again, this just wraps all the MSTSC options. So I can do a lot from here. So it gives you an idea. There's a link to this script in the slides. So it gives you an idea of the sorts of things that you can do with the. Oh, there's a console I brought up with the PowerShell commandlets. 16 minutes left. Just a quick check for questions. No, you're enthralled or switched off or fallen asleep. PowerShell drives, these are quite useful things. In PowerShell itself, when you connect to C:, for instance, is actually using a PowerShell drive. So we can do a get PS drive. And you see these ones at the bottom here. These are coming because I've got a connection to VMware. So what I can actually do is a dir, if you're a CMD person, which actually again is an alias for get child item. That's always a bit of a mouthful. So we can do, for instance, VI:, and that's my data center. I can tab complete. So I could go through, if I've got multiple data centers, I'm tab completing there. So what's in there? So we can see my various entities. And again, some of them are, most of them should be in folders, but some have escaped from folders. We can see it that way. But I can also look at my data stores. Again, in top level data center. So I've got a couple of NFS data stores and then a couple of SSD data stores on those rack mount machines behind my picture. So if we look at one of my VMFS data stores, so we'll look at that's the array at the front. You can see on the right hand side, probably my head might be in the way, which is a RAID 5 array with a hot spare. So we can see the various folders and machines. And again, just pick a machine. Now notice I hit tab there, and this is one of the problems with the PowerShell providers. They're quite slow. So if you want to do a lot of operations, okay, there's one for instance. Yeah, if you're doing a lot of operations, it can be very slow. There are other ways. There is a web interface into them, which is actually what I use for a folder browser for the disk CD mounting in that VMware script I just showed you. It's a lot faster. But we can remove files and copy files. Bearing in mind, if you're copying files to non-VMFS, then you're going to expand them. We can do quite a lot. We can't do everything you can do with normal NTFS local files, but there is quite a lot we can do with those PS drives. Demos speak like 1,000 words. So some Horizon stuff. If any of you guys are working with Horizon, there is actually a Horizon module which has a whole 3 commandlets in it. These are basically to connect to the Horizon server. Once we're connected, we actually use the View API directly. Again, I don't think I've got any examples on my GitHub, but I write a lot of scripts for a company called ControlUp who make these publicly available. So if you go to their script site, which again, I think there's a link in the notes, then you can look at some of my View scripts on there. Oh, I mustn't call it View anymore, must I? Sorry, I've been around this space, well, since VDM first came out, however long ago that was. So yeah, Horizon. So we use a Connect HV server to connect to the Horizon server. And then once we've done that, we can actually use this Hyper-V module from VMware, which gives us some extra PowerShell commands if we want to use it. Or if you're comfortable with it, you can use the API service directly. You basically just call objects from this connection. Again, for sake of time, I'm not going to go into demos. What I tend to use now, to be honest with you, is the REST API rather than the Horizon commandlets. But again, I'm doing that from PowerShell. Why? Because it's very easy in PowerShell to drive a REST API, which are getting pretty standard. I was doing some coding last week for Azure, again, using the REST API rather than the PowerShell modules. And the benefit of that for the Azure work, the VMware work is, there's no prerequisites for VMware modules to be installed and present. Now, I'm writing scripts for software vendors who then have their end customers. If you tell them, oh, you've got to have this PowerShell module installed or this PowerShell module, that's a barrier to adoption and them running it, because if they're not PowerShell people, they'll struggle to do it. Or if they've got an estate of 1,000 machines and you say you need PowerShell on those 20, it's like, oh, what a pain. Whereas with REST API, there's no prerequisites. It can be a little bit more wordy in terms, because you've got to set up headers, you've got to authenticate. But once you get the hang of it, again, you might not think you could do that. Go and get somebody else's code. Yeah, my code for I've got quite a bit of code in my GitHub for various REST APIs. I don't think I've got any VMware stuff yet, but I'm going to probably modify some of mine to use the REST API. Again, in earlier versions of Horizon, it wasn't fully featured, but as of 8. Whatever we're on now, it is pretty much fully featured compared with their SOAP API. And there's some great examples there. I forget where that goes. So yeah, Andy Morgan, a VMware guy, who's got some very good stuff out there. And similarly, which probably doesn't work in PowerShell 7, we can see what we're connected to. 10 minutes. Okay, quick thing about running scripts. Like I said, use a jump box. Use scheduled tasks to do them. Yeah, scheduled tasks for PowerShell, it's pretty straightforward once you've done one and understand how they work. Basically, just calling PowerShell.exe with a link to the script and the parameters you want. So who you're going to run it as, make sure you run it as an account that has access to your vCenter. That's what you're connecting to. Not passing passwords in clear text anywhere. Just a couple of things generally with scheduled tasks that true and false will generally get flattened and won't work. So if you've got something that takes a true or false, you generally have to change the script to take a string unless you use a switch type argument. And flattened arrays, what that means is, if I specify machine 1, machine 2, machine 3, like I mentioned earlier, then it'll actually pass a single item called machine 1, machine 2, machine 3. But again, using the split operator I showed you earlier when I was looking at PS module path, it's very easy to turn that back into an array. So the first time you encounter it, it's like, oh, what's going on? Then you remember, and then you just put those things in automatically. And it's very easy. Again, PowerShell has built-in SMTP email capability, so you can set up your alerting or reporting messages from that scheduled task. If you're going to run these things again manually, well, who are you running it as? Are you going to run it as your domain admin, or do you want to create an account, effectively a service account, and then give it exactly the permissions it needs and no more? Leech privilege in vCenter and in Windows and anything else that's integrating with. Remember, least privilege, folks. I don't log onto my desktop as an admin. I log on as a non-admin. I have an elevated PowerShell window if I need to do anything elevated, but reduce the attack surface massively by not running stuff needlessly elevated. Do you want to add a GUI to your scripts? Easy enough. I've showed you that WPF GUI for my PowerShell script to manage VMware earlier. I wrote that in Visual Studio using drag and drop, and then just took the code over, a couple of boilerplate functions into PowerShell script. Again, you just take somebody else's script. I didn't write that function that fires up the GUI. I just took somebody else's. And of course, you put a comment in if you borrow anybody else's code. It's always polite to put a comment in saying, this is from this particular URL, rather than claiming you wrote it. But it doesn't need to be a fancy GUI. You can just prompt read host in PowerShell. Which VM would you like to act on? Please enter, and you use read host. So it doesn't need to be WPF. WPF does work in Windows 7, as you just saw, because that GUI of mine was running under PowerShell 7 on Windows 10. So even though it's PowerShell 7 is effectively PowerShell core, doesn't have built-in GUI stuff itself because it can run on Linux and macOS, you can still add .NET features to it, such as WPF. Good old RTFM. So how do we do it? Well, if you use PowerShell ISE, everybody else will say, well, use PowerShell code. Well, today I actually did start using Visual Studio Code. Why? Because when I took this script, so this is the VMware GUI scripts that I demonstrated earlier. So if we search for things like get VM in here, you'll see that here's a bit that, for instance, get snapshots. Notice what I'm doing here is actually module qualifying the call to get VM, which you might need to do depending on whether you use that thing called Hyper-V as well. So if you're running this on Windows 10, which is the business SKUs, because that could well have Hyper-V enabled, because get VM is also how you get virtual machines in Hyper-V. Again, some notes in this slide deck about how we make sure that we're using the one for the technology we're using. So here I'm module qualifying, so it knows which module get VM is in. You don't have to do that for all your calls, because that would get a bit of a pain having to know where they are, make it a bit more wordy. But this is put in because I have had problems when it's tried to go to Hyper-V. So Visual Studio Code works. I mean, if you're using PowerShell 7, there is no PowerShell ISE for PowerShell 7. So VS Code is the way people go. I stuck with ISE, which is built into Windows PowerShell for a long time, simply because I was doing a lot of coding on customer systems. So that's got built-in help with good old F1. Get help I showed you earlier. The get command again, again here I demonstrated this earlier. And then there's plenty of VMware documentation for everything. So some great examples. So the easiest way to write a script is find somebody else's or find some examples and cobble them together, test them, and then improve them. Again, if I'm going to start a brand new script for something, I will look to see if there's anything out there already that comes anywhere close. If there is, then I'll probably take that, understand it, and modify it. But of course, putting in, again, a comment to say who I've borrowed the code from to give them credit. So there are plenty of examples out there, both from VMware and from third parties. But as I said earlier, check any code, even if it comes from VMware, that it doesn't accidentally delete all your machines or network adapters or data stores or anything else, because it may not be tested in your exact environment. And of course, good old people will say to me, "Oh, go and Google that." No, I use DuckDuckGo, but yeah, don't use Bing. So a couple of miscellaneous things as I'm kind of running out of time. Yeah, exactly what I've just said. You could do a remove module, Hyper-V, check it's there first, with an error action, silently continue. So that's easy enough to do. If I do a get module, let's clear the screen. Actually, let's go to PowerShell 5. I don't know if Hyper-V works in PowerShell 7. So I can do a get dash module minus list. But again, I'm tab completing hyper star. So you see I've got the Hyper-V module here, so I could do a Hyper-V / get dash VM. And how good this noise cancelling is, because I hear my granddaughter crying in the background again. Actually, I'm running this non-elevated, but it doesn't actually tell me in the error message that it's trying to use Hyper-V, except of course that's a pretty big giveaway. So that's where you could actually, so we can say get command or alias GCM get dash VM, and you'll see it's actually in Hyper-V there. So if I do a get dash VM, I'm not even going to get any VMware ones, but I could do a remove dash module of Hyper-V. You see we've actually should have no command for get dash VM, but that's because I haven't imported the VMware module. So that's actually automatically gone and found out my cache. Notice how slow it was. So that's why your scripts, you should always automatically at the start use an import module, because if you don't, Sod's Law says your script will work for you because you've loaded that module, but if you've not loaded it if your customer's never loaded it, then it won't go and find it in your cache modules, which are in your local user profile on Windows. So just do the import dash module vmware.vimautomation.core in this case, as in import module, or if you're doing it on the command line, IPMO there, because I'm in terminal, I can right click and that just imports that module. Our grid view is fantastic. Let me just quickly demonstrate that. So it's almost like a built-in GUI. So I'll do a get dash VM pipe to out grid view, or OGV is the alias. Yeah, it doesn't give me a great deal of stuff, but what I can then do if I tell it, because by default it only outputs a few properties, but I can tell it to select all the properties. That will now come in for every VM I've got, give me this grid view where it will give me everything I want. I can sort this on whatever, so I can say, okay, which machine has got the most CPUs? So I click on num CPUs. This is a grid view. Scroll to the bottom because I'm sorting ascending. Come on, catch up. 1 minute left. I won't overrun, honest, I never overrun. So you can see I've got a couple of 8 CPU machines, so they're not mining machines at all. Powered off because that didn't go very well. It just heated up my garage, and I would have spent more on electricity than I would have got in cryptocurrency. But I can filter things in here. I can do a quick global filter. So if I want to look for any of my, again, old habits die hard, all my Horizon stuff is called View. It does an automatic filter on everything. So wherever it sees View, for instance, it will put in there. But if I want to do more specific, I can filter on these columns. So any of these columns at all. So only show me those which I've got. And you see it knows it's numeric. So I can say is greater than or equal to 8. Now it'll just show me all my machines which have got 8 gig. I can remove columns if I don't want them. So VM host ID, I don't particularly like that. That doesn't really mean anything to me. So I'm going to get rid of that. Or I'm going to get rid of folder ID, resource pool ID. Oh, my time has just expired. My PowerShell clock, again, that's on my GitHub repository. I find that quite useful, particularly when troubleshooting, because I can, there's various modes. There's a clock one here where I can actually use that to say, make a note of when something happened. I can go mark, guy should have finished speaking. Then I know exactly that. And again, that was when that time is when I hit the mark, not when I entered the text. So rather than scribbling things on post-it pads when you tried a connection or when something failed, that's built into that PowerShell clock as well as the countdown timer. And it's also got a stopwatch in there. So I didn't get through all the stuff that I didn't think I would. I never do, to be honest with you. There's so much content, so little time. But out-grid view is great. If I've still got a grid view, up. Yes, I have. One of the great things about it is you can highlight any line and actually just control. You can't right-click on it because it doesn't have a GUI built in, but I could do a Control-C. And then if I go to, let's say, that fantastic program Notepad, which I did have in there and I've now managed to lose, it puts all that data from that line. So if there's anything I needed to get from there, I need to make a note of it. But again, if I'd got multiple machines selected, so let's say I'd got selected those 2 machines, again, Control-C, pop Control-V, then you can see I've got that data. A bit crude. There are better ways to do it. Mine is passed through, as the slide says. Okay, well, that's me run out of time, but I'll say I'll make the slides available. Hopefully there's a few people still awake, and if you haven't done PowerShell automation of VMware, that might hopefully whet your appetite, sort of things you can do. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, ping me with questions you've got. I can't guarantee an answer. But I do my best to help, because that's all the power of the community is helping, enabling everybody else. Back to you, Ben.